Well, we drove past via Stanguellini yesterday on the way into Modena, and this is a typical example of a smaller race car company from this part of the world, but very successful in its own right. And Formula Junior, what a great category!
It was. I mean, it was. It was created to find. It was created to find a new generation of Italian racing drivers. And
a bit like Tony George created IRL to create a new generation of American racing drivers. Didn't last long, but
no. And of course, Formula Junior eventually grew into Formula 3, as has been ever since. But this is a Stanguellini, and it's very like, I remember thinking it was just like a sort of baby van wall, isn't it? It's very similar. I love the offset cockpit and everything, and a lot of people, made their name in these things. One of them being Lorenzo Bandini, who obviously, eventually drove for Ferrari for many years. Bandini was racing one of these in 1959 and winning a lot of races, and making a name that led to Formula One. So they weren't very quick, these things. They didn't have a lot of horsepower, but they raced well, and a lot of drivers learned a lot about wheel-to-wheel racing in them.
But Lorenzo, let's talk a little bit about Lorenzo, because he was. I mean, Chris drove with Lorenzo obviously in '67, and they won the Daytona 24 Hours
and the Monza. 1000 Ks,
and he was very fond of Lorenzo.
He was extremely fond of Lorenzo. Yeah, and they'd sort of known each other for a while, but when Chris joined Ferrari at the end of '66. They just completely hit it off. They just became very, very good friends from the word go. And it was just terribly sad the way things went. They started off like with this sort of dream start, winning these first two races in '67, and then Lorenzo was killed at Monaco.
And Lorenzo was. I mean, there are many race drivers out there. Most of them are very nice people, and we can say all day, oh, he was a nice guy, he was a nice guy. But there's also a thing about respect as well. And obviously Lorenzo had Chris's respect. He had Jim Clark's respect as well, and they were good friends.
Yes,
they were surprisingly close.
Yes, they were.
More than most drivers out there, Jimmy and Lorenzo.
Yes,
and I was actually at Monaco in '67 when Lorenzo had his accident, and I was watching from the station hairpin, and I can clearly remember, I was only a young kid, but I can clearly remember seeing his helmet moving back as he was accelerating out of the hairpin just before his accident. It really looked like he was tiring, and it was Monaco was a 100-lap race.
Yes,
then,
absolutely.
And it was, and that chicane was very quick.
It was very quick, and there was no power steering in 1967,
And we didn't learn from anything either. I mean, it wasn't the first time somebody had gone off at the chicane there.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Peter Ustinov, I think you were telling me the other day, actually saw Ascari go into the water at Monte Carlo.
Yes, he did. Ustinov was watching at the chicane, and was sort of. Ustinov was a great racing enthusiast. Followed it closely, knew what he was watching. Moss was leading in the Mercedes and blew up. And actually, just before the chicane, came through the chicane and then was dropping oil. And Ascari unknowingly inherited the lead because he hadn't been past the pits anyway, so they couldn't even give him a pit board. But he arrived at the chicane and found Stirling's oil. And at the same time, he was in the Lancia D50, which had a perpetual problem with snatching brakes. And the car just went out of control and went through the very, very flimsy sort of, odd poles and sandbags and whatnot, barrier at the exit, and straight into the water. Ustinov saw him come out of the tunnel. He said he came shooting out of the tunnel, and then it was like a sort of trick of the light. Suddenly the car wasn't there anymore, and nobody could quite figure out where it had gone until they saw this cloud of steam and smoke coming up from the water, and it sort of word began to, God almighty, he's in the harbour. And then, he said he did actually start to feel quite sick because he thought there was such a high chance Ascari would have been knocked unconscious by the impact with the water and would drown. And he said after what seemed an interminable time, finally this light blue helmet sort of appeared on the surface of the water, and Ascari immediately began to swim towards a rescue boat. And then, of course,
Astonishing.
only 4 days later, Ascari was killed in a testing accident at Monza.
Not wearing the light blue helmet.
Not wearing the light blue helmet, which had always been his lucky charm.
That was being repaired. The chin strap was being repaired from
the
Monaco.
Monza accident. Yeah, in those days they had one helmet. They didn't have a different one for every race.
And he was incredibly superstitious, Ascari, wasn't he?
Yeah,
And all the numbers were
yeah.
stacked against him, or for him. I don't know which way, but the numbers were there.
He was very superstitious, and one of them was this. It's common. I think it is a common superstition. This fear of number 13 and multiples of number 13. His father, who'd been a great driver in the 20s, was killed on the 26th of July, multiple of 13, and was 36 years old. This day at Monza was the 26th of May, so ordinarily his sort of phobias would have been floating around, not an ideal day. But he hadn't intended to drive at all. He'd simply gone to Monza that morning to watch Castellotti testing a new Ferrari sports car. And he was wearing a suit and tie, you know, when he arrived at the track.
As he would normally.
As you would. After they'd had a bite of lunch, he suddenly decided, you know, the old thing about get back in the saddle as soon as possible after a big accident, and got in this car. And friends of his, like Luigi Villaresi, close friends who were there at the time, were astounded to see that he was just going to borrow Castellotti's helmet. And for once, you know, not driving his own helmet, and on the 26th and everything else. And he went out in the car and, you know, slow first lap, much quicker second lap, third lap really going for it, and he never came back from it.
And it was at what was then the Vialoni chicane, now called the Ascari chicane, that he had the accident.
That's right, yeah.
Wasn't there a story too about a black cat crossing the road on the way to Monza that morning?
Oh, there were always, there's no question, he did have an intense phobia about black cats, because he had passed a black cat on the way to a race, which happened to be, and that was the first big accident he ever had. And then it happened again, and he astonishingly had the second big accident of his career. So after that, he had a complete fetish about it. And if he saw a black cat, Villaresi recounted that on one occasion they took an inordinately long detour, and were actually late getting to the racetrack because he would not pass this black cat. Turned round and, you know, but he was
he was
a lovely man, and he was the last, it has to be said, he was the last truly great Italian racing driver.
We lost Ignacio Giunti very early, and we lost Lorenzo.
We did, yeah, absolutely.
And others. But
Castellotti and Musso both went young, and. Yeah.
But if you had to try to quantify Alberto Ascari in terms of his talent and where he stands overall in the history of the sport, where would you?
Oh, we're right up there. I mean, something that always struck me. I remember talking to Dennis Jenkinson. We were talking about the World Championship era, the whole way through from 1950 to today, and I'd asked Jenks to pick 5 drivers, you know, his top 5 from all those years. And he chose Ascari. He did not choose Fangio. And what he said about those two was that he said, you know, Fangio was no question Fangio was a great driver, and he had amazing ability and qualities and all the rest of it. But Jenks said, but when Ascari was in equal cars, he could beat him whenever he wanted. And he said in his estimation, and he was there, remember, the whole time, he saw every race, he thought Ascari was unquestionably the greatest driver of the 50s.